The Ogre Kingdoms is a sledgehammer army with no equal, making up for what they lack in subtlety by sheer raw strength and brutality. Even the basic ogre unit, the Bulls, are so heavy that they cause impact hits on the charge, meaning that they are the equal of chariots upon impact. Many of their elite units have stat lines that rival that of heroes of other factions, and wield weapons so massive they're capable of killing even another ogre in a single blow. And as if that was not enough, the Ogre Kingdoms field a wide variety of monsters as ferocious and belligerent as their ogre masters, easily capable of overcoming entire units of ranked up infantry in a single massive thunderous charge. If an army of massed super heavy infantry thundering across the battlefield, impacting upon the enemy like a tidal wave, and then proceeding to tear them apart limb from limb in violent, brutal melee, all the while supported by hulking monstrosities, and bloody capricious magic is your kind of thing, then the Ogre Kingdoms have got you more than covered. As usual, we'll start out with the heroes, beginning with Greece's Goldtooth, the Overtyrant. Greasus is the only Ogre Tyrant to have done something considered more or less impossible by many of his peers. He has united several of the Ogre tribes within his reach into a sort of empire, which is how he earned himself the title Overtyrant. Greasus's armies are the best equipped in the Ogre Kingdoms due to the massive amounts of levies and tithes imposed upon the tyrants under his protection, and even those who neighbour onto his realm have to pay this protection, as if they should not pay, Greasus cannot guarantee that his armies of ogres won't occasionally wander into their territory. He also takes a considerable toll from the various merchants travelling through his lands heading for Cathay. This wealth has allowed him to buy one of the most uncommon commodities in the Ogre Kingdoms, loyalty. For while other tyrants have to deal with various lesser ogres having ambitions upon their position, Greasus does not need to worry overmuch about this, simply because if one of his underlings have an interest in his throne, there will be 5 more than happy to deliver this upstart to Greasus, and collect the bounty offered for any such free thinker. There is some controversy as to why the Ogre Kingdoms bordering Greasus's kingdom have not simply banded together to overthrow the Overtyrant and thereby rid themselves of his harsh taxation. Part of the reason is of course that Greasus's armies are vast and extremely well equipped by Ogre Kingdom standards, and also the simple fact that in the Ogre Kingdoms a massive prodigious gut is considered a sign of nobility, and very few are anywhere near as massive as Greasus, who is easily the equal in size to 2 Ogre Tyrants. Lastly, and perhaps the simplest and most persuasive of reasons, is the simple fact that the surrounding Ogre Tyrants can never be quite sure which of their potential allies is already safely secured in Greasus's pocket. And seeing as none of them can fully trust each other, banding together and cooperating to the extent that would be required to take down the Overtyrant is next to impossible. In gameplay terms, Greasus would be a supportive type of hero, and although he is extremely strong in close combat, even stronger than the bloodthirsty Greater Demon, he is too fat, too lazy, and too fond of his own life to really make much of a fighter. However, he could have many buffing abilities, increasing the melee potential of nearby ogres by offering a bounty for whichever ogre brings him the most enemy heads. He might be able to distract enemy units by showering them with gold, and he could rally fleeing units by promising them great wealth should they return. Additionally, he possesses two magical items, the first of which is the Scepter of Titans, that grants him his incredible strength, and the Overtyrant's Crown, which grants him his prodigious intelligence by ogre standards. So, in other words, he comes reasonably close to the village idiot by human standards. Nevertheless, his massive amounts of wealth and influence would mean that he could be an extremely powerful buffing and controlling general, and it wouldn't take too much implementing within the Total War Warhammer game. Next up, Skrog the Slaughterer. Skrog was initially a respected slaughtermeister under the arch-tyrant Bronn Rockgrinder. However, he made the rather grievous mistake of slaughtering, cooking, and then serving the tyrant's pet Gnoblar to the tyrant, who, upon realizing what his dinner was, and although it was delicious, he could very well let a slight like this pass, and so he chopped off both of Skrog's arms, and threw him into the pit where they keep the gorges. It was expected that Skrog would provide a feisty, yet in the end, inevitable meal for the gorges that lived inside the caves. However, Skrog was so ferocious that the gorges accepted him as one of their own, and having gained their trust by shows of unusual violence even by ogre standards, gathered up as many gorges as he could find, and trekked back up to the surface one particular deep dark night, and enlightened his previous arch-tyrant lord exactly why you shouldn't be letting food go to waste. Having slaughtered the entire Rockgrinder tribe in a single night and fed them to his new gorger protégés, the Great Maw took quite a shine to Skrog and his innovative culinary ways, and so Skrog became a prophet of the Great Maw, a living avatar of its ghastly will. And as a prophet of the Great Maw, Skrog wields practically unrivaled authority among the ogres, and can, as a result of this, gather vast numbers of ogres together and go adventuring into the wider world in search of new and interesting things to add to his pot. In game terms, Skrog the Slaughterer would be a fairly potent combat creature, but primarily he would be a buffing wizard. Being a prophet of the Great Maw, he has access to pretty much everything within the Ogre Kingdoms' magic arsenal, which consists primarily of buffs. And while it can be a bit difficult to get Skrog and his closest allies going, as in tabletop terms, Skrog is ridiculously expensive, weighing in at 425 points, and not all that tough, making him into a giant pulsating bullseye for every single enemy artillery piece out looking for some easy points. However, should Skrog and his dinner guests get going, you had best get out of his way, because there are no brakes on this particular rape train. That being all the ogre heroes I consider worthy of mentioning, I will now move on to the heroes and lord level characters, starting with the Tyrant. The Tyrant, being the leader of the individual ogre tribes, is the biggest and baddest bastard around, having subjugated the other ogres, a race known for their strength and violence tendencies, by strength and violence tendencies. The Tyrant Lord is one of the more potent combat lords in the entire game, and if properly kitted out, can be an absolute avalanche of a unit. And while there is no subtlety built into a Tyrant, this guy will not be a buffing hero, this guy will not be a controlling hero, and he will most certainly not be a magical hero. He does only one thing: hit things with large blunt objects, and he is very, very good at his chosen profession. The only real things that I could actually take on a Tyrant and win would be things in the weight class of a bloodthirster great demon. And while he might only be a hammer, he is a damn fine hammer. The next big Lord-level character is the Slaughtermaster, a Lord-level wizard in the gut magic. And while not quite the combat beast that an Ogre Tyrant is, he's still got a better stat line than a lot of dedicated fighting lords of other species. And with access to gut magic, he can buff himself and his closest cronies to high heavens, creating a nigh-on unstoppable unit capable of buffing the strength of ogres and making them able to regenerate. And kitted out with the right magical equipment, the guy is nigh-on indestructible. And while he is perfectly able to handle himself in melee, just like a tyrant, the Slaughtermaster comes with the added benefit of being able to cast magic from the back lines should he find himself outside the thick of the fighting. Then onto some of the smaller heroes. We'll start out with the Bruiser. The Bruiser is among the Ogre Kingdoms considered just a hero-level character, but his stat line is still the equal to most Lord-level characters of other factions, and is the perfect hero to add just that little extra bit of oomph to one of your nice big fat smashy-bashy melee units. And while he can't take quite as many magical doodahs as the Tyrant or the Slaughtermaster, with a few added magical thingy-bobs, he can add just enough oomph to your Bulls charge to break even massed units of spearmen on the charge. And while not, again, a particularly versatile creature, who needs versatility when you've got an army consisting entirely of 25-ton killing machines? But if you insist on versatility, there is always the Hunter, slightly more expensive than a Bruiser, while unable to lead units except for his loyal saber-tusk giant monstrous catties. The Hunter is also one of very few ogres actually able to use a ranged weapon, with a gigantic crossbow firing crossbow bolts the size of, well, tree trunks, which in game terms means that he does not function as a crossbow, he functions as a ballista with legs. Not to mention, he is one of the few ogre heroes that can be mounted, in this case on top of a stone horn, turning an already fairly potent combat character into an absolute monstrosity, albeit a very large, rather expensive monstrosity that doesn't have that much resistance to cannonballs. Then comes the de facto mage of the Ogre Kingdoms, the basic butcher, not quite as powerful as a Slaughtermaster, neither in melee or in magic, but seeing as most ogre gut magic has a relatively low threshold to be cast, he is a more than capable wizard, able to provide buffs and magical support to your main melee units such as regeneration, extra strength, and bonus impact hits. And while the Slaughtermaster is limited to gut magic, the Butcher can take magic from the lore of beasts, death, and even the lore of heavens, giving him a bit more flexibility in his spell loadout. But, again, if subtlety and flexibility just isn't your thing, and if you're considering playing ogres, I don't see why they should be, there's always the Firebelly. These fiery personalities are hero-level wizards that specialize in the lore of fire and killing stuff with fire. And while the lore of fire in and of itself is pretty brutal in any circumstances, the fact that the Firebelly also has access to a strength 4 breath weapon, in other words, he's capable of breathing fire, turns him into an excellent frontline melee unit, as he is essentially a giant walking flamethrower that can, on occasion, throw fireballs. And, being one of the few units in the Ogre Kingdom's armies with a proper magical attack, he is a must-have if you're fighting armies like the Vampire Counts, with tons of ethereal and magical units. He is also one of the Ogre Kingdom's premier answers to horde armies, as while killing a unit of 50 Skaven slaves with your Ogre Bulls is gonna take a bloody long while, incinerating them a dozen at a time with his breath weapon is going to shorten the ordeal considerably. Now, as you've probably already noticed, the Ogres don't have a whole lot in common with most other races in the way that they use their actual heroes, which could prove to be problematic in a Total War game, especially if we're looking to have a bit more of a complicated character and family system, where you can raise your characters to do different things, as the Ogre Kingdoms don't really have that freedom. And while the Ogres technically do have families, as in they mate and they give birth, they're not much for parenting, Grease's Goldtooth, for example, when he was a teenage ogre, he killed and ate his father, so they're not much on love, peace, and equality. You could of course get around this by simply just saying that the Ogre Kingdoms just generate characters. For example, you win a battle, you've got a 25% of one of your ogres having done some unique and fancy-like, and therefore being available to recruit for a sum of gold, and then add him to your family tree, where he would start out as a bruiser, for example, and could then develop into a tyrant, slaughtermaster, a butcher, or a firebelly. The hunter is a little bit more problematic because of technicality. The hunters are ogres that have been sent out from the tribe, banished for some perceived slight, real or otherwise, and wouldn't really make a whole lot of sense within the family tree of essentially the ruling faction, as he is essentially an outcast. However, he could of course be recruitable through events, for example. So, while it does offer some challenges, there are workarounds, and I would like to actually keep the more complicated system where you can specialize your heroes, even though it's going to require a bit of fluff reworking every now and then for the more special factions like the ogres. With that out of the way, let's take a look at the Ogre's core units, starting with the Ogre Bulls, the humble line infantry of the Ogre Kingdoms. While they've got a stat line that would make most heroes of other factions envious, they are quite expensive, and therefore quite few in numbers. And while one-on-one, an ogre is the match for pretty much any standard infantry in the Warhammer world, and additionally, if they charge a certain distance, they gain impact hits, they are more than capable of overcoming fully ranked up units of infantry. However, being few in numbers and being as large as they are, means that there's usually only going to be 3 or 4 ogres fighting across a frontage against a couple dozen normal humans. And while an ogre might be big and strong, every ogre is going to be fighting 3 or 4 humans, and if you stab an ogre enough, ogre's going to fall over. And while you can kill 3 men in a ranked up infantry unit and not really get a whole lot out of it, if you kill an ogre, that is a substantial decrease in their combat potential. Now, in game terms, I would think that Ogre Bulls should be relatively numerous as far as monstrous infantry goes. Maybe as large a unit as 30 models, perhaps. That would essentially work as a cavalry, as they would have a fairly large charge bonus, but of course being bigger and easier to hit would also have quite a lot of weaknesses towards ranged weapons. In short, an Ogre Bull unit by itself is going to struggle against a fully ranked up infantry unit. They could beat them, but it's going to be a close run thing, which is where you want to be adding in your hero level characters to add that extra little bit of oomph needed to overcome the rank bonuses of enemy infantry. But that is of course not the only core unit available to the Ogre Kingdoms. Next up is the Iron Guts, and while they are a fair bit more expensive than normal bulls, they have higher armor, higher leadership, and are therefore sturdier and less likely to break than their lesser cousins. And while Ogre Bulls are usually armed with 2 melee weapons, giving them an additional attack, the Iron Guts are armed with great weapons. And in the case of ogres, a great weapon is really a massive piece of armament. And the sheer size and weight of the weapon means that the Iron Guts excel at killing heavily armored or particularly tough elite infantry, as there's not a whole lot of things in the Warhammer universe that can survive getting hit by an ogre wielding a 2-handed mace, and could therefore be considered the Ogre Kingdom's premier answer to heavily armoured or particularly tough enemy units, like Empire Knights or Beastmen Minotaurs, for example. In game terms, they would serve much the same purpose. While the great weapons means that they can't attack as quickly as the bulls and therefore will struggle more with ranked up units of infantry, although they should probably have some sort of AoE attack against these units because massive ass weapons, the primary role would still be to take out heavily armored or particularly tough units that the Ogre Bulls might struggle with. Again, I'd probably venture a unit size of around 30 models, as all in all they're not that much more powerful than the Ogres, having only one higher armor, and they would still be extremely vulnerable to incoming fire. However, there is a way around a lot of this incoming fire, namely the pet Gnoblars of the Ogres. The Gnoblars are a core unit, and unlike the Ogres, are very, very cheap and can be taken in vast numbers. And while not particularly tough, strong, brave, loyal, or indeed anything, they do make excellent meat shields for your larger, tougher, more valuable Ogres. Place a unit of Gnoblars in front of your Iron Guts, and odds are they're going to be eating the occasional arrow or crossbow bolt instead of your big, expensive, valuable Ogres. Additionally, being extremely cheap, Gnoblars can simply just fill out your Ogre horde, providing a bit of meat, upon which you can slow down the enemy, giving you time to maneuver your big, nasty Ogres into position for the finishing hammer blow. Being as weak as they are, this should be a classical horde unit of 240 odd models. And while in tabletop they have a ranged attack, where essentially they just pick up whatever lies around them and throws it at the enemy, this could be slightly problematic to illustrate in the Total War game, although in all due likelihood you'd simply just give them a very limited ammunition javelin attack, essentially, except it would be very low damage. It'd be more of a distraction and a way to slow the enemy down rather as a real way of inflicting real permanent damage to the unit. On to the special units. The first up is the Lead Belchers. Stat-wise, they're the same as an Ogre, but with +1 ballistic skill, which means they're about the equal in marksmanship of a blind, dumb, deaf, and recently mutilated human. However, they do not require marksmanship of any great standard because what they are firing are cannons loaded full of grape shot. And these massive-ass shotguns, which can be fired on the move, do not require any aiming, though they do require 2 turns of reloading. In gameplay terms, these guys should essentially be a unit of Ogres, but a lot fewer in numbers. Maybe, I'd like to say 10, but I'm pretty sure that 10 cannons worth of grape shot would just instantaneously delete any unit it hits, so probably not. I'd probably have to go with 3 guys, maybe 4, meaning that they've got no chance in everlasting hell of actually taking on a fully ranked up unit of infantry in melee, though they are going to be killing half of it with grape shot. To simulate the long reload time, they should essentially have to be stationary to reload, and it's going to have to be quite a long animation where they reload their cannons. Additionally, being very few in numbers, they would be reasonably easily countered by range unit and would so require a fair bit of protection. But, seeing as they are mobile cannons loaded with grape shot, I think that a certain amount of fragility is probably for the best, considering how redunculously devastating they have the potential of being. Could be interesting to see them be given an option to fire actual cannonballs as well, as while not entirely backed up by the fluff, it could make for a kind of cool artillery unit. They would have full accuracy, but I mean, you could do it. You're not likely to hit much unless they're in deep formations or something, but still it'd be a bit of flexibility, which the Ogre Kingdoms do require a bit of. The other part of Ogre society generally considered insane are the Man-Eaters. These are essentially bigger, badder ogres with a variety of potential special rules. They can, for example, be given heavy armor, which is a rarity within the Ogre Kingdoms. They can also be made immune to psychology and stubborn. They can be given swift stride, which of course increases their movement speed. They can be given sniper, which doesn't help much in units of man-eaters, though some of them carry braces of grotesquely large pistols. Not going to be of huge help in Total War, where the average unit they'll be facing are going to be like 160 men, but nevertheless an interesting little thing. They can also take Scout, which would essentially be guerrilla deployment, and they can take a wide variety of these. Now, all of this is probably a little bit too complicated for Total War games, so in all due likelihood the man-eaters will simply be a 30 to 60 man unit of bigger, badder ogres with some special abilities. Maybe they could fire their brace of pistols before charging, for example, which could make them pretty damn good anti-other big guys units, as they'd fire fairly high damage weapons before charging in, and then start walloping whatever it is they're hitting over the head with massive ass weapons. And having heavy armor, they're a fair bit more durable than the average Ogre Bull. That being it for the ogres again for the moment, we have some of the ogres' allies, the Yetis. Now, in tabletop, the Yetis are not particularly good units. In fact, they're one of the worst units in the Ogre Kingdoms. However, in Total War Warhammer, you could do a lot more interesting things with them. For example, seeing as they are more beastly than their ogre cousins, they could be given a higher movement speed, allowing them to be a sort of ogre light cavalry, perhaps. Or maybe they could be given an aura effect of a biting cold that reduces the weapon skill and attack of nearby enemy units. Or perhaps you could simply boost their stat lines a bit and make them into actual shock infantry. Though the Ogre Kingdoms already have plenty of shock infantry, so I'd prefer if they did something a little bit more special with these guys. An aura, for example. Make them really fast and essentially make them into light cavalry would be kind of interesting. Have a unit of 10 of these guys, for example, 10 to 30. And have them be really fast, but not particularly good in a fight, so they're basically perfect anti-skirmisher units, and can also deal with enemy light cavalry, but not going to be much of a threat against fully ranked up units of infantry, although they could be a very valuable flanking force. Another not entirely ogre unit are the Gorgers. The Gorger is a monster, so to say, in tabletop settings. It has a reasonable stat line, and it deploys by ambush, which means that on a dice roll it will appear from either the long board edges or the short board edge. It will either appear on the flanks of your enemy forces or to his rear, which could be a really interesting mechanic in a Total War game. When you're fighting an Ogre Kingdom's army, these would of course have stealth on the deployment map, so you could never actually see that they were in the army. But when fighting ogres, you'd always be a little bit nervous that a Gorger would suddenly pop up behind your lines from your deployment zone and start nobbling your artillery. By themselves, they're not particularly good fighters, although they are relatively fast, so again, they could be kind of a almost a skirmishy unit, really. A fairly heavy melee skirmishing unit, to be sure. But it wouldn't be able to take on ranked up units of infantry, and it would really struggle against any kinds of heavy cavalry. Let's say they came in units of 5, for example. More than enough to make short work of an artillery unit, but also few enough to be driven off by heavy cavalry, and it would therefore be used more as a strategic ambushing tool and a way to distract and scare your opponent just a little bit, rather than just another shock unit. Speaking of shock units, you might remember in my Vampire Counts video I mentioned that the Blood Dragon Vampires were some of the heaviest cavalry in the Warhammer world, which is impressive considering it is a world that contains these beasties. Ogres mounted on giant woolen rhinoceroses. Equipped, of course, with heavy armor and Iron Fist, which counts as shield, nice big weapons, and of course the fact that the angry-ass rhinoceros is, if possible, even angrier than its rider. These guys are the second heaviest cavalry in the entire Warhammer world. And there are very, very, very few units indeed that can actually stand up to a charge from these monsters, and that should be represented in the Total War game. Now, these guys are so ridiculously powerful that I say there should be probably a unit of maximum 5, perhaps even 3, because even a unit of 3 of these guys would probably just absolutely destroy a unit of ranked up infantry. You're really going to have to deal with these guys with multiple units or overwhelming firepower. And even when their charge is spent, these guys are not easy to take care of in melee combat. They're giant woolen rhinoceroses with heavy hides, capable of deflecting, or if not completely deflecting, then at the very least severely diminishing the impact of a sword blow, and the riders are ogres wearing heavy armor. Even if bogged down by infantry, these guys will cause all kinds of trouble before they finally shuffle off to the Great Maw in the sky. And they're really one of those units that just have to be in if they're going to do the Ogre Kingdoms, because they're just so cool. I mean, just look at those models. Ah, they're beautiful, they are. Onto something else that's absolutely just adorable. We go to the rare units, to the Iron Blaster. Ah, yes. That is a massive-ass Sky Titan cannon mounted on an angry rhinoceros. I did say that the Ogre Kingdoms lack ranged units, but the ranged units they do have are certainly impressive, I'm sure you'll agree. In gameplay terms, this thing is essentially just a bigger, badder cannon. This thing would absolutely demolish walls, and firing massive-ass cannonballs should probably just be a single model, if not maybe 2 guys, as the cannonball they fire would be considerably larger than that of a normal cannon, and so would just bounce through units, killing dozens of people. However, it is mounted on a Rhinox, and Rhinoxes, even at the best of times, are not considered to be the most cooperative of creatures, and standing still enough for accurate artillery fire is most definitively not one of their fortes, so they should be ridiculously inaccurate. Essentially more of a pure siege weapon than an actual damage to units weapon, as while hitting a city wall is not too problematic, hitting of infantry scurrying around the place is considerably harder, especially as your firing platform hates your guts and wants you to fail in every possible respect. Another piece of ogre artillery, this being the last one, is this scrap launcher. Not quite as impressive as the Iron Blaster, but the idea is much the same. Though while the Iron Blaster is more of a siege cannon, this is most definitively an anti-infantry weapon. Essentially, what it does is that the catapult on the back is filled with all manners of rubbish gathered up by the Noblars. This pile of rubbish is then catapulted towards the enemy, as a form of indirect fire grape shot. And while not particularly lethal to heavy infantry, this will absolutely destroy lightly armored units as they get pelted by everything from swords to shields to helmets to random pieces of rocks and the odd gnoblar that got a little bit too close to the catapult as it was fired. Plus, as all ogre artillery, it is relatively mobile, well, by artillery standards, and anything charging the scrap launcher is going to have to deal with the angry Rhinox up front before they can take care of the softer crew of Noblars in the back. But enough about this silly artillery nonsense. You're not playing Ogre Kingdoms for artillery, no. You're playing the Ogre Kingdoms for stuff like this, the Stonehorn, the first of the 2 big scary monsters. Effectively a guided missile. This one hurts like a nuclear warhead on the charge. And as the name suggests, its hide is as hard as stone, meaning that even cannon shells have problems denting this big old bastard, and any unit not completely shattered by its massive earth-shattering impact are going to have to deal with this bad boy in melee, which is not an advisable position to find yourself in. In game terms, it would be exactly that. It would be a single model, and I would love to be able to mount a family member on this thing. That would just be brilliant as a super heavy cavalry mount. It'd probably be the equal of any single infantry unit and really require something a little bit special to stop it, like massed firepower or big guy units. Because while it would completely and utterly destroy a unit of infantry trying to stand up to it, another unit of ogres, for example, different story. Or maybe something nice and big like a greater bloodthirster. A dragon, perhaps? Or just a skeletal giant, you know. The Warhammer universe has many wonderful things capable of clobbering even things of this size. Lastly, we have the Thunder Tusk, the second of the big scary bastards. This one doesn't get quite the charging impact of its Stonehorn cousin, and doesn't perform nearly as well in melee, but it has 2 riders, which certainly helps, plus it has a breath attack. And not only that, it has an aura that freezes nearby enemy units, causing continuous casualties. And while it doesn't have quite the impact on the charge of the Stonehorn, this thing is by no means a slouch when it hits home. In Total War terms, it should essentially work as a bit of a 1-2 punch with the Stonehorn. If possible, you'd like for the Thunder Tusk to charge in slightly after the Stonehorn, using its aura to weaken the attacks of the units surrounding the Stonehorn, which have now probably shattered the unit it already hit, and is now involved in melee combat with several other infantry units. Additionally, the Thunder Tusk, being less of a pure melee monstrosity, could be an excellent mount for a hunter, or a butcher perhaps. It would make a pretty cool mount for a wizard-type character. And of course, breath weapons are always nice, especially in an army like the Ogre Kingdoms, because while they have a lot of really amazing units that can brawl with the best of them, they do struggle a bit with horde armies. And so anything with a breath weapon is very, very welcome indeed. Now then, for some conclusions. Personally, I think that this would be one of the easier armies to implement, really. They are essentially just a more or less vanilla-ish Total War army with most of the unit numbers cut down and the stats increased. They don't have anything particularly unique or special like the Vampire Count's ability to raise additional units on the battlefield, for example. Their magic is relatively simple to emulate by simply having buff spells, since they don't have that much in the way of nuking spells. The ones they do have are relatively low strength and are more inhibitive than devastating. Additionally, while the family tree might prove a slight problem, it's not a particularly large one and could probably be bypassed relatively easily, and what you end up with is then a really cool heavy infantry focused charging army. And with the recently implemented migrating horde mechanics implemented in Attila, an ogre migration could be a really interesting campaign. Because while in Attila you are more or less predestined to be fighting the Romans, because you don't really have that many diplomatic options, the ogres would not necessarily enter the Empire to fight the Empire. They might hire themselves out as mercenaries. They might not enter the Empire at all. They might go south. They might go north. The possibilities for an Ogre Kingdoms faction would really be endless. And while there would certainly be some balance issues, considering it is an army made up of entirely of giant, hulking, brutish monsters with massive appetites and a inkling for violence, they are still essentially normal melee infantry units for the most part, with some super heavy cavalry. And so I don't think that implementing them in Total War game would be too far-fetched. Well, that has been my thoughts on the subject. I hope you found it interesting. I have been Arch. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. It really helps me. So, thank you, and have a good day.